It took his grandma a long time to fall asleep in her chair. She sat there working a buckskin, making it soft and pliable with her hands. Twice the skin dropped to her lap, but when Dewey stirred on the floor, she straightened abruptly and said, "What was that?" "It was just me, Grandma." "Well, how come you don't go on to bed? You can't get no sleep down there on the floor." She rose from her chair as she spoke and moved to the window. The cabin was well built. The cracks chinked tight against the wind. There was real glass in the one window, and Grandma now hung a cloth over it. "There," she said. "I'll stay up with you a while," Dewey said, and with a faint nod, grateful for his company, she went back to her chair. She sat, and her head was again bent forward over the buckskin. Dewey waited. A screech owl cried behind the cabin. Dewey glanced quickly at his grandma, knowing she would say someone was going to die. That's what she always said when she heard a screech owl. "Grandma?" he said quietly. There was no answer. She was asleep at last. He rose and moved in absolute silence to the door. But at once the dog shook himself and his ears flapped noisily against his head. Dewey winced. He drew his shoulders up and waited for his grandma to awaken and snap, "What you up to, boy?" But she did not stir. Still without a sound, he lifted the bar and opened the door. The dog was outside first. The boy followed, pulling the door shut behind him. He breathed deeply of the cool air. Usually he loved the prairie at night. It seemed to him that this was the way the ocean would look far out at sea. He glanced over the dark waves of grass that were almost moving in the moonlight. But tonight there was no pleasure in the sight. He was uneasy. His grandma had done it, he told himself angrily, talking about her feeling. Now he was filled with dread, too. He thought of going back into the cabin. He even lifted his hand to the door, but then he stopped, wishing suddenly he could be strong like his pa. His pa would never be frightened by an old woman's words. He would never stand here undecided, one hand raised to the door, one foot turned to the river. Dewey took a deep breath, and glancing over his shoulder, started down the path. At the bank he paused to look down at his raft. He felt better as he looked at his handiwork. Dewey thought that it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. As he stood there, he had a brief, startlingly clear picture of himself on the raft under the long green shadows of the trees down the river. He saw his hands, broad and strong, gripping the oar and thrusting it into the shallow water, sending the raft over the water like a wind-blown leaf. Smiling, he glanced over his shoulder again and then stepped onto the raft. It was made of 9 logs lashed together with strips of hide and was approximately 6 feet across and 8 feet long. Atop the logs, Dewey had laid a floor of smaller split logs, nailing them so that they formed a platform. He had earned the money for the nails by picking up bones on the prairie and selling them in town. He had done all the work himself, and he felt a pride that he had never known before. It was the only thing he had ever made that was for himself alone. His family was almost machine-like in the way they worked to keep alive and comfortable, and sometimes Dewey felt that every hour of his day was taken up with the land and the animals, that he was part of the farm in the same way that the plow was, or the wagon. The raft was a separate thing, built only to give pleasure. It seemed to him as fine as any of the rafts he'd seen on the big rivers. 5 years before, while waiting to cross the Mississippi, he had counted a string of 120 rafts on its long journey to New Orleans. He had seen the low doghouses for the crew to sleep in, and a raft as big as a field, with a tent for the family and fences for the horses and pigs. His was just as sturdy, just as ready to withstand the twists of the current as those. He knelt at the front of the raft, where he had put a large split log with a smooth side to the front. He took some stain he had made from old walnut hulls and dipped his finger into it and began to print across the front of the log, slowly, carefully. Ignoring the stain that was running down his finger, he began to print the first letter, T. A wolf howled in the night, and Dewey glanced up. The howl was far away, and after a moment he resumed his work. Once he had seen the wolves from the doorway of the cabin. They sat in a half-circle in the deep grass and howled in the moonlight. And when one wolf, the leader, had turned toward the cabin, his eyes had flashed green in the moonlight. Sometimes Dewey saw their tracks at the river and in the creek bottoms, but tonight they were far away chasing elk and deer. His hair, bleached pale from the sun, fell unnoticed over his eyes, and in the moonlight his tanned skin was darker than his hair. The tip of his tongue touched his upper lip as he worked. Now he straightened and looked at the words he had printed. The Rosy Bee. The letters were even, and again he felt a surge of pride. The Rosy Bee is a good ship, he thought as he looked her over. And now she was ready for her first voyage. There was a noose of rope thrown over a stump on the bank to hold the raft ashore, and he slipped this off and coiled the rope at his feet. With mounting excitement, his fear forgotten, he bent and picked up the oar lying across the raft. This was his treasure. He had found it on the bank of Big River a year ago when he and his pa had gone over to get some wild plum trees.